I've come here today with the solution to climate change. Yay! Got it in one. This is true. Because I got it from the inventor of climate. Yeah? Person who, the one who created the earth, created the world, created climate, set everything in place. Isn't he the one we should be going to find out the solution to what's happening in our world today? We go right back to the beginning. God created the world. You read in Genesis how he created the world. Not only that, he made a beautiful garden. And in that garden, who did he put in the garden? Adam and Eve, that's right. And why? Because he wanted to get to know them. He wanted to spend time with them. He loved them. Isn't that amazing? The creator of the world wanted to spend time with Adam and Eve, with people. And he gave those beautiful gifts, the world, the trees, the food, that Adam and Eve could have the food and just exist in a beautiful paradise. That's what it was. And every day God would come and talk with them and walk with them. Can you imagine anything better? Didn't have to dig the garden, you didn't have to put the rubbish out, nothing. Everything was perfect.
Didn't have to pay taxes.
Didn't have to pay taxes at all, that's right. The human, didn't have to do the dishes, that's right. The human's relationship, our relationship with God was linked to this garden, to this land that he had created. It's the first promised land, was this beautiful garden. And it came with simple instructions, right? Do you know what they were? If they obeyed God, if humans obeyed God, they could continue to live in this beautiful garden infused with God's presence. But if they chose to act on their own wisdom and go their own way and ignore God, they would forfeit the land that God had given them. You see? God gave the beautiful land, but he said, you can live in it and you can have all the benefits of this land as long as you obey me, the commandments that he gave. So the land, in the Old Testament, it's very much the land is connected to the people and their relationship to God. It's not something that that we sort of have now. We don't connect the land the same. The Indigenous people of Australia, the Aborigines, if you're allowed to say that now, I don't know, but they are very much connected to their land, aren't they? They are. They're just connected to their land and they love their land and they act like guardians of the land. And that's very biblical. That's there in the Old Testament. That's exactly what happened in the Old Testament. Their relationship, Israel's relationship, was very much linked to their land. If they obeyed God, their land would flourish. Like we heard in the Bible reading, that was very clear, wasn't it? Moses gave them the 10 Commandments, or God gave them the 10 Commandments, and Moses said, if you obey them and if you listen obediently to the voice of God and heartily obey the commandments that I command you today, this is what Moses said, God your God will place you on a high above all nations of the world. And the blessings came, you heard them. Blessings inside the city, blessings in the country, blessings on your children, on the crops, on the livestock, on the herds, on the flocks. Blessings on your basket and your bread bowl. In the NIV it says the kneading bowl, it's the bread bowl. God's blessing on your coming in and your going out. God will lavish you with good things, children, offspring for your animals, crops for your land, and the land that God promised your ancestors that he would give you. God will throw open the doors of the sky vaults. This is what it says in Deuteronomy. He will open the doors of his sky vaults and pour rain on your land on schedule, not in flood, on schedule and bless the work that you take in hand. It's clear as mud, isn't it? No? Isn't it clear that God says, obey me and I will bless the land? He gave us this land and he wants us to flourish in it and get the blessings. So we hear if we obey God and live the way that he has asked us to live, the land will flourish and will be looked after by God. Is that clear? Yeah? So what happened? What happened? Something has obviously gone wrong. Does God not love us anymore? Is that why? How many times have I heard people say, oh, if God is a loving God, why does he allow bad things to happen? Have you heard people say that? God gets the blame for everything. But why is the world in a mess? Is it right to blame God? We heard about prophets this morning, Hank. That was really good because this month we're starting on learning about prophets and everyone's picked a different prophet. And I've picked my favourite prophet, Hosea. He's only a very small book in the Bible, 14 chapters, but I've always loved it. It's a bit of a, you read it and it's like, oh my goodness, but there's some absolutely beautiful parts in Hosea. First of all, what is a prophet? What's your understanding of a prophet? Sorry, hang on. Foretells the future.
A man in very close contact with his God.
Very much so, like we heard with Elijah. He saw things that nobody else saw because he had a close relationship to God. Anybody else got any? Yes, Nina?
God's messenger.
God's messenger, exactly right. Because if you look at all the prophets in the Bible, God especially calls them. They don't go, oh, you know what, I reckon being a prophet will be good. I think I'll be a prophet. No, God picked them. And some of them weren't very happy about it either. Some of them didn't want to take the message of God because it was hard to be a prophet. People in the world have enjoyed calling themselves a prophet, haven't they? You heard of Nostradamus? And there's heaps and heaps of self-proclaimed prophets. Here's some examples of predictions that have been made by people who think they're prophets. An official of the White Star Line, speaking of the firm's newly built flagship, the Titanic, launched in 1912, declared that the ship was unsinkable. Would you call him a prophet, a reliable prophet? Because one of the things about prophets that the people in the Bible said it was a true prophet or an untrue prophet is if what they said came true. All right, here's another one. In 1939, the New York Times said the problem with TV was that people had to glue their eyes to a screen and that the average person wouldn't have time for it. What would they say about computers now? And another one, an English astronomer professor, said in the early 19th century that air travel at high speed would be impossible because passengers would suffocate. Have you been suffocated in a plane yet? No. So the biblical prophets, as we said, prophets, you have to be appointed by God to the world, and their job was not just why they predicted or why they said what's going to happen in the future, was always because their whole mission was to turn the people back to God. They had messages directly from God. God would give them the message and say, now go and tell the people. And most of the time, he rose up these prophets to tell people they were on the wrong track and they needed to return to God. They had to give the message of God accurately. They weren't allowed to embellish it or make it sound more palatable. There was a prophet, Micaiah, who said, as surely as the Lord lives, I can only tell the king what God tells me to tell him. So the king might have wanted to hear the message and he'd go, no, go back to God and give me a better message. No, I can only tell you what God has told me to tell you. Jeremiah tried to he was another prophet in the Bible, And he begged God, I don't want to be a prophet anymore. It's too yucky. The people hate me. Everyone hates me. And he ended up being put in a big pit. And his prophecies or his predictions didn't come true till after he died. So he had a miserable life. Jonah, you know Jonah, he was a prophet. And he said, no, Lord, I'm not doing what you want me to do. And what happened to him? Got swallowed up by a big fish, didn't he? And there's another one in the First Kings. There's a prophet in there. We don't know his name. And he didn't do what God told him to do. God said, don't go into that town or else. And he didn't listen. And he ended up, a lion killed him because he directly disobeyed God. Sometimes the prophets looked a bit strange. Elijah had to wear a garment of hair and had a leather belt around his waist. Elijah had his mantle, a special mantle that he passed on to his Elisha. Ezekiel had to shave his head and his beard, and other prophets were set apart. Jeremiah, for example, wasn't allowed to marry, but Hosea, the prophet we're looking at today, was told to marry a prostitute. So their lives, what they did, their whole life, was a picture to the people around them about God. Not just the words they spoke, how they looked, how they dressed, how they lived, was all a message. The little book of Hosea is tucked away in the Bible. He was a prophet for about 60 years. And he was told by God, if you look at verse, you've got to go and read it, it's really good. If you look in verse 1, chapter 1, he said, God called me and asked me to speak to the people and warn them strongly. If they don't return to God, they will be punished. They will be captured and taken away by a foreign king. They weren't interested in listening to Hosea. He was bringing a negative message to them. Does it sound familiar to today? He was telling them bad things. He might hurt my feelings or give me a bad vibe. No, they weren't going to listen. And Hosea's God, they said, oh, he must be pretty vengeful to talk like that to us. But Hosea said, no, he's telling you this because he loves you, not because he wants to hurt you. He wants to bring you back. You know what the people were up to in that time? They were living their own lives, didn't listen to God anymore. They had a bad king that was leading them, who had allowed them to build, who carved a statue of a god called Baal. And this is who they were worshipping. And lots of really bad things they were doing around this worship of Baal. You have to read it yourself. I don't even want to speak some of the things in here. But God was really angry. And you know what? He could have wiped them out. But if you read in Hosea, he says, but I'm not human, I'm God. So he was ready to forgive them, even though they had gone so far away from him. And not only were they flaunting it and putting it in God's face, and they were really, rubbing it into God almost. God had looked after them. I'll tell you what he says. Oh, I better tell you first what happened to Hosea. Poor old Hosea had to marry this woman that I think he loved her, Gomer her name was, and they had 3 children together. But God said to him, I told you their lives were hard, the prophets' lives were hard. He said to Hosea, you know what? You're going to marry this woman and she's going to end up leaving you and being a street prostitute. So why didn't he say that? Why didn't he say, don't marry her? Why do you think he did it? Like I said, prophets often, their lives were an illustration to the people around them. And God wanted Hosea to suffer in a way that he suffers himself. God suffers when he sees the world going bad. And God was saying this relationship between you and Gomer is like his relationship to us. It's like a marriage. And how would you feel like poor old Hosea when his wife left him and left him with 3 children and went off with other people? She felt that she could get more from other people, from other men, than she could if she stayed. And it was an illustration of exactly what was happening to the people of Israel. God had loved them and cherished them and fed them and led them out of Egypt and given them a beautiful land, and they turned their backs on him and went and followed these idols made out of stone. You see how it mirrored what was happening. And once that happened, Hosea's message to the people changed. He didn't did the gloom and the doom to them. He said, come back to God because he loves you. He loves you so much. I'll tell you what he said. Hang on. I've lost it now. It'll come. Hang on. Because, she ends up being sold as a slave. And God said to Hosea, go to the marketplace. Your wife, do you still love her? And you know what he said? Hosea said, yes, I do. Just like God still loves us. And Hosea had to go down to the marketplace and buy his wife back. And she was now a slave. I'll tell you how much. He offered 15 pieces of silver and a bushel of barley, and he bought her back. The auctioneer's gavel fell, and Hosea had his wife back. You see how God used Hosea's life as an illustration, because he buys us back, doesn't he? Through Jesus. He buys us back because he loves us. He took her home, put good clothes on her back, and led her home by her hand. The book of Hosea depicts a time when God was fighting for his people who had gone off and following a false god. He could have wiped his hands of them. And you know what? He actually, he says, they had got so bad that he had to turn his back on them. So it must have got pretty bad, mustn't they? And he had to turn his back on them. And he said, you'll come looking for me, you won't find me because I've turned away. I hope we never get to that point in our world. And this is how they were living. Hosea 4, chapter 1 to 3. Attention all Israelites, this is God's message. God indicts the whole population. No one is faithful, no one loves, no one knows the first thing about God. All this cussing and lying and killing, theft and loose sex, sheer anarchy, one murder after another. And because of all this, this is what God says, the very land itself weeps and everything in it is grief-stricken. Animals in the fields and birds on the wing, even the fish in the sea are listless and lifeless. That's what it says in Hosea. You'd think he was reading out of one of our newspapers today, wouldn't you? That sounds just exactly like our world today, doesn't it?
Yes.
You reckon? Don't you reckon? When I read it, I thought, oh my goodness, this is like 700 or so years before Jesus came. But it sounds like he's reading out of the Herald Sun today. But did you notice in that reading, not only have the people gone haywire, but the land is suffering too. Because of them turning their backs on God, the very land itself weeps and everything in it is grief-stricken. As we saw from Genesis, when God created the world and made that beautiful garden, the land, I'm sorry to say, the land reflects our relationship with God. And today, the land is reflecting, everything that's going on in the world today is reflecting the world's relationship with God. Isn't it? It's the world. Don't you feel like sometimes the world's gone mad? And things that we would once said they were good, and now people are saying they're bad. If you follow the Bible and the Ten Commandments, there's something wrong with you. The TV and the people are saying, no, it's wrong. The world's gone mad. And you know what I reckon? It's not just that the people are doing bad things. They're flaunting it, aren't they? They're flaunting it in God's face and in the face of Christians. It's almost like we're fair game. The Christians and God is fair game. The joke on the project the other night about Jesus, you know, they're sticking it to God. That's what I reckon it looks like. They're flaunting their sin. You put the TV on the news, half the news was full of the Mardi Gras with people prancing around. Look, what people do at home, this is what I always say, that's their business between them and God. But, you know, flaunting it and saying, woohoo, look at us. No, sorry, there's a limit. There's a limit. And we can't say to God, bless our land, God, when we're acting in this way. I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone. In fact, I think we have heard God so much that he has done what Hosea said in chapter 5, verse 6. He says, though they go in search of God with their sheep and cattle, they won't find him. He has withdrawn from them. I just hope we never get to that part, because God had to turn his back away on these people in Hosea's time because they were doing things that were so abhorrent to God that he couldn't look at them. And he said, no, I can't handle this anymore. But the whole book of Hosea shows God's despair at what people are doing and how far they have moved away from God. But it also shows the picture of love that God still has. He said, I'm not a human, I'm God. And I still love the people, just like Hosea still loved his wife and he went and brought her back. This is what it says in Hosea 11. When Israel was only a child, I loved him. I called out, my son, and called him out of Egypt. But when others called him, he ran off and left me. This is exactly what happened. He worshipped the popular sex gods. He played at religion with toy gods. Still, I stuck with him. I rescued him from human bondage, but he never acknowledged my help, never admitted that I was the one pulling his wagon, that I lifted him like a baby to my cheek. Isn't that a beautiful picture of God picking up the people that he loved to his cheek and caressing them? He was the one that lifted him like a baby to my cheek, that I bent down to feed him. Now he wants to go back to Egypt, anything but return to me. That's why his cities are unsafe, the murder rate skyrockets, and every plan to improve things falls to pieces. Sounds just like our world today, doesn't it? God's hanging in there with us, and even though the world has gone mad and is turning their back on God and not wanting anything to do with God, God hasn't given up. He loves us and he loves the world and he wants to make things better. But there must be a limit. So I get scared sometimes. I think, how often can they throw the grace and care of God back in his face? And I'm telling you, there will never be healing to our land until our relationship with God is healed. That's why our world is suffering climate change, floods, earthquakes, war, storms. The world, which is God's creation, is responding to the broken relationship the world has with God. It all connected, the land, us and God. Listen to this. This is Hosea 14. This is the very last chapter. This was God's call to Israel and God's response. O world, come back. Return to your God. You're down, but you're not out. Prepare your confession and come back to God. Pray to him to take away our sin. Accept our confession. Receive as restitution our repentant prayers. Military won't save us. Horses won't get us where we want to go. We'll never again say our God to something that we've made or made up. You're our last hope. I reckon that's where we're at now. And this is what God's answer was to Israel in the book of Hosea. I will heal your waywardness. I will love them lavishly. Not just a little bit, lavishly. My anger is played out. I will make a fresh start with Israel. He'll burst into bloom like a crocus in the spring. He'll put down deep oak tree roots. He'll become a forest of oaks. He'll become splendid like a giant sequoia. His fragrance like a grove of cedars. Those who live near him will be blessed by him, be blessed and prosper like golden grain. Everyone will be talking about them, spreading their fame as the vintage children of God. They are finished with gods that are no gods. From now on, I am the one who answers and satisfies him. I am like a luxuriant fruit tree. Everything you need is found in me. That's what God said to them after all they had done. And that's what he says to us too. I just want to finish. Reading a lot out, but it's so amazing I can't put it into words. God has already said it. This is what he says to us. I'm finishing on this. 2 Chronicles. This is what God says. Take note, and take note the world, because this is what he said. If I ever shut off the supply of rain from the skies, or order the locusts to eat the crops, or send a plague on my people, sound familiar? And my people, my God-defined people, respond by humbling themselves, praying, seeking my presence, and turning their backs on their wicked lives, I'll be there ready for them. I'll listen from heaven, forgive their sins, and restore their land to health. That's what he says in 2 Chronicles. He will restore our land to health if the world comes back to God. It's not what I say, it's what God says. So this is the answer to climate change. Return to God. Isn't it? Simple. Let's see what we can do. Let's just close in prayer. I thank you, Lord, for your word from Hosea. He must have had a really rough time as being your prophet. But because of his life, because of what he was prepared to go through, you were able to show us that even though you get cross with us, Lord, and with what we've done to your land, you are there, you love us. You want to pick us up like little babies and cradle us against your cheek. Lord, forgive the world for what they are doing. And I pray that we can return to you. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. Sorry, I get a bit emotional.